Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko Lisa McLaren tōku ingoa, no wararapa aho. A short disclaimer, I will be using my notes today. I'm on month 12, I think, of long COVID, and so I don't quite trust my brain yet, but we'll get through. My work life over the last 15 years, as sort of alluded to in the introduction, has sort of been at the intersection of policy and practice, especially at local government, and also activism. And I think that community-based activism part is something that we don't sometimes bring into this conversation. Those advocates, especially those volunteers doing this in their lunch times and after work or during school time, that space I think can be brought in a bit more. I don't know if there's a slide. Oh, you just put it up. Oh, and I get to do a photo credit of Rick. This is one of yours. So I'll come back to this image in a bit. So I'm currently in the last few months of a PhD at the Joint Centre of Disaster Research out of Massey University, focusing on community-led climate action. So looking into things like urgency, collective visioning, storytelling, equity and justice, emotion, and vulnerability. And also have worked across roles in emergency management through REMO, the local emergency management office, and sea level rise policy in local government here in Wellington, and now at Marsden District Council. Moved home to take up a senior policy advisor role there in the climate space and work out how we can do climate action differently in provincial New Zealand. So I really want to spend these 10, maybe now 8 minutes talking about how we hold the duality of hope and fear, because that's something that's been my sort of motivational driver this whole sort of 15 years in this space. It's sort of been a roller coaster of hope and fear. Sometimes they intermix and sometimes not, and sort of picking up on what Victoria was saying around taking care of yourself when you're in those fear-driven moments and focusing on that hope. So I first kind of fell into my big sort of fear dive or despair trap on the plane home from the UN climate talks in Paris. It was my second COP that I'd been to, and this one I was co-leading the New Zealand youth delegation, and they were there to challenge the government on their policies. And I thought I would read out just a short excerpt from my diary that I wrote on the plane home, because that's sort of where my PhD has landed, is storytelling. The reality of climate change has taken a huge toll on me, both emotionally and physically. Going to the Paris UN conference last month was one way I tried to confront this, to lean in rather than shy away. I tried to push the realities out of my mind ever since my first talks in Warsaw 2 years earlier. The thought of acknowledging and feeling those climate issues was too emotionally daunting, too much complexity, too many competing issues, too much harsh reality for one brain to handle. I was completely full of climate impacts, facts and figures, stories, anecdotes, images, realities and truths. Sometimes I need to acknowledge that working in the climate change space sucks. It's really, really hard work and emotionally exhausting, continuously discussing the fates of millions or billions, people I don't know, but why does that make them any less important? I discuss them as other, as if I won't be affected by these same impacts, and in many ways I won't. My activism is from a place of extreme privilege in a world littered of deeply ingrained structural inequities. While at the Paris conference the country signed a deal, finally, I was bearing witness, yet not trusting. My soul wept, "It's not enough," it screamed. I found myself getting caught up in the celebrations about promises that in reality may never be fulfilled. A step in the right direction, yes, but for whom? Maybe it was as good as we're ever going to get. It's hard to have hope that we can win this fight, but it's scarier not to have it. So that was my sort of the first, I guess, pit in this climate process, climate journey that I've been on. And it was 2 months later that some friends and I were in a cafe up the road here in Wellington, and we're discussing what we could do as part of the group Generation Zero that Karen will mention. But it's a youth climate organisation So we were brainstorming what we could do in Wellington to try and get action happening, and one idea that was brought up was this climate law. So that campaign turned into something called the Zero Carbon Act campaign. Gen Zero, we formed a group of us from around the country and lobbied for that law, formed the draft of it, and used many connections within central government of former Gen Zero alumni and friends to work out how to do drafting notes, and got a whole bunch of academics together in a room and said, we've done these drafting notes, this sort of draft framework, what do you think? And got that advice. And it was really, I know some of those academics were quite hesitant to come and talk to a volunteer youth group about this new idea they'd had. But because they did, and because they took it seriously, it then turned into something that really gained momentum. Obviously, the new coalition government picked it up in 2018, and then that formed into, after some very hard work, formed into the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Act of 2019. But what I was going to focus on there was, this was a youth group, a community group. This was some people that were trying to have hope and trying to put in a framework or a vision around an idea that we hadn't come up with. Our idea was based on the UK's Climate Change Act. We had to deal with some serious issues of bringing in a UK-style climate law to a colonised country. We had a lot of long hui around that, about what that means to be bringing in a UK-style climate law under the context of te tiriti and te ao Māori, and we got things wrong and we got a few things right in that space, and we learnt a lot, and I think it did reflect in the final bill. So, just wondering how much time I've got left. 2 minutes? Perfect. So that campaign gave us a lot of hope. The output that the government came out with, maybe not as much as we would have liked if our proper draft had got through, but it was enough to, I think, set the country on a track now where a lot of things are happening. So our framework had a national emissions reduction plan, it had the adaptation plan, it had the climate commission, it had integration of te tiriti. We didn't get through the stuff around that we wanted around obligations to our South Pacific neighbours, but I think that's happening now in other forum. So my job now, I left that space feeling hopeful yet still a bit afraid, and so I went back home to local government to see how that actually would work on the ground, and I chose a very small provincial council called Masterton District Council, and I've realised, being back home on the ground doing this work, that law isn't trickling down in the way that it could or should be. There are people, I think provincial New Zealand gets a bit of a bad rap with people thinking we don't want to do stuff on climate change. I could action 76 actions tomorrow around real transformational change in the district if my budget was more than 50k a year. And it's also hard to get those academic partnerships to do those studies because we are smaller and we don't have a university just down the road. So I guess a pitch would be to look at those smaller rural areas in your area and say, yes, you might not be able to do match funding on a project, but what sort of community groups are already in this space? Because we know that it's the local community gardens that's going to get us out of this mess. It's the stuff that those people already have the connections and are doing that work. So my job's just to support them, and really keen to collaborate with anyone who wants to help us do that. Is that in time? Yeah, okay, I'll just end there. Thank you.